I didn't go to sleep till like 3, so everything's fine. But I'm just, I'm gonna go deep with you all. Is that okay? I'm just gonna go for it. This was a really excellent opportunity, and I really appreciate Judy and Beck for letting me take stock of 20 years of being out. When I talk in corporations, I often say, look, for 20 years, I've been dealing with people dealing with me, right? And that's a developmental process all of its own. And I didn't kind of realize quite how deep it was until I put this speech together. So we'll just kind of go for it together. So I've been talking about transgender issues in culture, politics, and education and the workplace for nearly 20 years. 20 years before that, I had no words to talk about it, but I did live the stories. Today, I want to share with you some of those stories while making the connection to how the personal, relational, and institutional experiences of being transgender and non-binary, which, by the way, I'm both, are linked. Spoiler alert, it's through dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is discomfort, unhappiness, or distress due to one's gender or physical sex. The current edition, DSM-5, uses the term gender dysphoria, where it previously referred to gender identity disorder, making it clear that they no longer consider the gender identity to be disordered, but rather the emotional state of distress which relates from the gender identity. I just copied and pasted that from the internet, okay? Because I think just that, this idea that the emotional state of distress which results from the gender identity is something we need to work on. So let's pull back to the definition of dysphoria itself. A profound state of unease or dissatisfaction. That's the definition of dysphoria. A profound state of unease or dissatisfaction. Profound. It acts on all levels. And just as profound, I notice how we all experience dysphoria when it comes to gender. Today, I'm going to explore my own experience with dysphoria within a history of activism and media representation, which are the profound threads of my own life. Of course, I am only one person with one experience, but as a professional storyteller, I do know how the particular connects to the universal in real ways. I'm writing my second book, and this is a very early piece of it. You're the first audience to hear it. Sorry. I honor all of the differences that every person in this room may bring to my story. I ask you to let our diversity be our connection and not a distance, since diversity is the only constant in this world. I look forward to expanding on these thoughts and to listening to your reflections during the conference today, if you have them. I only ask that you consider the way that dysphoria can make us unpleasant to one another, and to be mindful of what is about your story, not mine, and to be constructive and kind with your comments, because this is really new work for me. I'm starting to see that dysphoria operates on levels that are personal, meaning psychological, relational, meaning all types of relationships we have, and institutional, meaning all of the institutions we engage with, from the classroom to the presidency, from the workplace to religion, and so on. I'm starting to see that we all have dysphoria on some level when it comes to gender, and that we do it to each other as much as we do it to ourselves. I hear why in this quote. The man who lies to himself and listens to his own lie comes to a point that he cannot distinguish the truth within him or around him, and so loses all respect for himself and others, and having no respect, he ceases to love. It's Dostoevsky. I'm looking at how the lies that gender made me tell were a function of a collective dysphoria that shaped my life in these 3 ways, inside and out. It's kind of a bummer, but spoiler alert, it resolves well. So let this serve as a content warning for everything that will come up in this story. This is definitely a PG to rated R, PG-13 to rated R kind of story, so please take care of yourselves and those around you as you need to. I think all of these things are symptoms and expressions of dysphoria. This thesis isn't new, but I want to go deep into it. The dysphoria I lived was not the result of my gender identity. It was the result of the dysphoria that we all have and inflict on each other. When I look at so much of the things that I did and thought, I knew I wouldn't have done those things if I knew about dysphoria. I choose to believe that the politicians and the media and all the people they impact would not have said and done many of the things that they did had they known that they were caught up in dysphoria. If I had known, I might have known how to meet my challenges. I might have learned the necessary tools sooner rather than being pushed around by the force of it for so long. Once we all investigate the dysphoria we are experiencing and enforcing on one another by ways that we insist on gender on a collective societal level, I believe we will find constructive ways to evolve through it, and I believe that this is part of the trans magic that trans people have always brought for humanity to experience and learn from. You're welcome. I want to start by asking you, please don't hear me blaming any of the challenges I faced on my parents or my upbringing. No one who raised me had the tools with which to recognize their own dysphoria when it came to how they treated me, nor any understanding of what dysphoria would lead me to do to myself. I do not in any way believe that my family would have done the work of dysphoria if they knew what it would do to me. And I believe the same about you. I believe that we can heal from this by looking at it and dealing with it. So people resist the push to ask for pronouns. These tiny words bring out the strongest reactions, mostly because they're just so unimportant, right? Hello? Pronouns were being used for me before I was born. They're so important that we lather expectations onto people who haven't been born yet with them. They are the most important piece of this conversation, and we can't start to change without changing our sensitivity around the use of pronouns. Case in point, my mother knew I was a boy. I had a name and clothes all picked out for me, awaiting my arrival. Then the moment I was born, I was wrapped in a pink blanket. Dysphoria drowned out the powerful force of my mother's own intuition. Dysphoria set in the moment I was born, starting with me and my mother and spreading out from there. Starting with the pronouns that they used before my birth. Funny how nobody had a problem changing that pronoun real quick back then. Relational dysphoria acts first and strongest and most long-lasting. How could anyone not have known I was trans? Look at me. The obvious fact that dysphoria works silently, often unconsciously. It's how we can look at the fact of our body in a factual mirror and still see hallucinations. My relatives all looked at that little boy and told him what a cute little girl he was. This, by the way, was where I started lying. Because what was truth when truth was just a bold-faced lie literally every important adult told me and expected me to tell? In 1986, Lou Sullivan founded one of the first advocacy groups for transgender men and publicly challenged psychological and medical institutions who claimed that trans men could not be gay. In the 1987 revision of the DSM, the American Psychiatric Association added gender identity disorder as a classification for transgender people. I would not know about this until 2003, but all of us would know it powerfully through culture and policy throughout my life. At this age, I went to a summer camp at the Y for a week. My dad was really late dropping me off the first day. He said, "Go on in, register yourself, figure it out." I was like 7. So I went in and I told him my name was Scott, because it was. And I had this week free. One of the things we had to do was get a buddy to go to the bathroom. So me and this other boy went to the bathroom on the first day. I went into the stall, he went up to the urinal, he said, "You sit down to pee?" And I said, "Yeah, you stand up to pee." And by the end of the week, he was sitting down with me. I never told anyone that story until I was an adult. After that week of freedom, I was filled with self-loathing. I was a liar. I couldn't speak the truth, and that terrified me more. Being something unspeakable. I was a little boy until I was 11 years old. I remember the day that it stopped. It was sometime in the summer, maybe July or August, and I was out back behind the garage with my best friend, Fran. Fran was another boy whose real name was Francis, so he had gender problems all of his own. We were building a fort out of moldy wood behind the garage, and I wasn't wearing a shirt because I never wore a shirt between the end of July and September. I didn't have any breasts to speak of, and my hair was so short everybody assumed I was a boy, and I didn't disabuse them of the notion. I was headed into 6th grade, and Fran was headed into 8th. He asked me where my shirt was, and I told him it was too hot for one. And then he replied, "You know you need to start acting like a girl." At that word, I dropped to one knee and began furiously pumping my Reebok Air high tops in order to avert my attention from his and his attention from me. Remember those shoes? "Oh yeah?" I said, "Well, what if I don't want to?" "Then I won't be able to stop what happens to you," he replied. I have no idea what he meant, and to this day I still don't, but I remember feeling duly terrified, knowing that it meant some kind of horrible bullying would take place, not sure if it would start with Fran, and so I ran back inside and put my shirt on. I became the best girl I could to protect myself from what would happen to me if I didn't. Now, the same year this photo was taken, Brandon Tina was brutally assaulted and murdered in Nebraska. I wouldn't know about it until I was in college. Stories like his didn't make newspapers where I lived, and anyway, when they did, they all called Brandon Tina and a woman. One of my most important people told me very seriously that I would go to hell if I didn't accept Jesus as my Lord and Savior. I knew that Jesus would never accept me. It was my first experience of institutional dysphoria, where I found a profound and extremely painful discomfort in relating to religion and to God. I became deeply depressed, lost my sense of attachment to the world, attempted suicide a month later, and never really felt sustainably happy again for 15 years. Just a friendly reminder that they have banned people from the military before, and it was eventually overturned. In 1994, the Gazebo, a dedicated chat room for transgender people, was started on AOL by Gwendolyn Ann Smith, providing a gathering place and resource center with a bulletin board. Remember those? By the mid-1990s, Ms. Smith said the Gazebo had tens of thousands of unique visitors a month. In 1995, Phyllis Fry and Ricky Ann Wilkins held the first transgender lobbying day in Washington, D.C., which would seed a harvest of transgender rights organizations. Now, right at this time, I was a queer kid in Charlotte, North Carolina who loved theater. I loved pretending to be someone else. Theater was where I turned dysphoria into something that felt good, which other people applauded. Now, the short version of what happened was, when the Pulitzer Prize-winning play Angels in America toured through Charlotte, an upswell of homophobia made national news. The elected officials of my county took all public money away from the arts, slashing after-school and symphony programs to, quote, steward public funds in the face of the homosexual agenda. A Democrat said into the microphone of the county commission meeting, beamed into my television at home, that, quote, all homosexuals should be pushed off the face of the earth, end quote. Now, I didn't know that I wasn't gay at the time, but most people still don't know the difference between gender and sexuality either, so all I knew was that I was one of those people that these powerful people hated and would take things from. And from their perspective, that was all I needed to know. This debate went on for years, every day in the paper and on the local news station we listened to in carpool. It happened out of the blue, on impulse. Or maybe in hindsight, it didn't. It was relational. My first girlfriend's father found out we were dating and beat her up. I hated myself for doing that to her by being me. In 1991, 1 year after the murder of Rita Hester, Transgender Day of Remembrance was founded to record, observe, and honor trans people lost to violence each year. This is the same year that the film Boys Don't Cry depicts the brutal assault and murder of Brandon Tina, and the cisgender actress who played him won an Oscar. But at the time, it felt really good, didn't it? Didn't it? Now this is where I want to point out that when every single cisgender actor who wins an Oscar for playing a trans person, every single time, shows up looking just as cis as they can be, it reinforces the dysphoria in global audiences and instructs them that trans people are really just the sex they were assigned at birth and are just playing dress up. That is what the fight about casting transgender actors in transgender roles is all about. It is about dysphoria. We are fighting to make Hollywood stop infecting everybody with dysphoria. If you knew that that's what Hollywood is doing by not casting transgender actors, you wouldn't fight us. You would join us. If you knew the life-saving miracle of seeing one trans person on screen, you would join us. I wonder who I would become if I could have seen someone like me then. All I know is how I accepted it, the way I always shrunk myself to fit every hero on TV, how I celebrated it even, and how it fed into my dysphoria. During the summer of 2000, I spent a summer in New York City and I met the first man I knew to be trans. He provided me with a copy of Leslie Feinberg's Transgender Warriors and Kate Bornstein's My Gender Workbook. Finding out that trans people have existed across all time and every culture, that we're everywhere, it was like seeing stars and knowing that they're there even in the daytime. Also, in the fall of 2000, I was involved in a car accident that should have killed me, but which just gave me really bad PTSD. I started therapy and lucked into a beautiful and accepting therapist who took my lead when I wrote a big question mark on the line provided for gender, and we ran for it. I did my first solo performance in 2001, the first time I spoke my story into the world. It was a non-binary manifesto about a decade before people would start using the word non-binary to describe themselves. The word genderqueer, which came into use about 5 years before that, felt outside of my generation and definitely outside of Atlanta where I lived. Not a word I could say to my mama that she would understand. Plus, it didn't account for how I mostly wanted to be called he, even if I knew I was a deeply queer feminist him who felt totally fine, in fact, a little in love with his femininity. Here's a piece from that solo performance. What's up? Till I was 11 years old, I thought I was a boy. Look what we do to boys in our culture. Does this boy look like he's got a feminist consciousness, like he's got a thought worth much of anything rolling around in his head? Yeah, but it's a white boy's world, right? We let him go and we don't face the consequences. If I'm oppressive, you're repressed, oppressive, repressed, repressive, oppressed. If you're repressive, I'm oppressed, oppressive, repressed. It doesn't make any difference. It's not about your hair or what you wear or what you got going on down there. As long as we are standing at the door to the law, we're letting the folks behind it control everything. Yeah, I wore the training bra. I went through the decathlon of puberty. Everybody and his best friend's mother training me to be a woman. I'm with Ani DeFranco. She said, you could try to train me like a pet. You could try to teach me to behave, but I tell you, if I haven't learned it yet, I'm not gonna sit. I ain't gonna stay. But maybe I didn't want to be a man. Maybe I like it just fine, thank you, exactly the way I am. Man, like this, I got choices. I can elect myself king of the world or be selected by a group of my peers as queen for a day. I want an identity card for this moment. You know what I'm saying? It is not about your hair or what you wear. We are bodies in a metal tube hurtling fast through time and space. So what are we going to do to get there? Where? There. Where the space inside lives out loud, where social control goes underground, and we can speak with our mouths full of who we are. Who am I? Touch me. What am I? See me. Where am I? Taste the air with all of your most beautiful senses, and then you tell me, huh? Without saying a word. People liked it, but they didn't know what to do with it. I was an independent artist for over a decade because the idea of being a transgender actor wasn't even really an idea back then, even as I was having more of an acting career than most of the people I graduated theater school with. I gave my first educational workshop in 2002. This is where I finally had words and concepts, like that sexual orientation and gender identity are two separate concepts, that trans people have existed across all time and every culture but have been erased and we don't call it transphobia, that misgendering and dead naming feels like death by 1,000 paper cuts, that embodying your authentic gender identity, however works for you to do so, is necessary, not cosmetic, and more. Y'all, I work to put myself out of a job, but I have been giving basically the same speech at least 12 times per year, every year since. But like I said, this is a new speech just for you. Around the same time, the Transgender Law Center was founded, along with the Sylvia Rivera Law Project and the National Center for Trans Equality, which means that individually and collectively, we were all speaking our truths louder than ever, but into a deep, silent space of relational and institutional dysphoria that refused, often violently, to hear us. And then, it's just as shocking to me as it might seem to you, another one. Again, relational. Toxic relationships always made me want to kill myself, because if I weren't myself, relationships would not be toxic. How could I be anything but toxic, or in anything that wasn't toxic, as a person steeped so heavily in dysphoria? If you can't love yourself, how can you love anyone else or accept healthy love? In 2004, I changed my name legally, and I had one of those run-ins with institutions that would become the norm. How are we all doing? Everybody okay? All right. So I stood before a judge and changed my name legally. Myself and 5 women from the Tri-County area each enjoyed this simple but powerful legal transformation on this particular Thursday, extracting ourselves name first out from under the thumb of the man. The man, in my case, an intransigent social system which conflates sex with gender and will not let me be who I am. The man in the cases of each of these women, their ex-husbands. Differentiate as you will. Now, I am judged and found unworthy of manhood in the checkout line. I didn't need to formalize the process, but it had to be done. Try as I might, I could not get the femininity out of my given name. And just to make things interesting, I did all of this in Texas. Yes, Texas. We assembled, my 5 lady friends and I, before the judge. Emotional exchanges about alimony and paternity had been echoing off the hallowed walls of justice for a good half hour and continued, whispered over the shoulder pads and the backs of chairs in between decrees. My hands poured sweat as I sat in my dress slacks and tie. For all I knew, they might think I was one of them, a minion of the man. Katie Lauren Kilborn, the judge called. I rose and made my way to the stand. As he watched me approach, he laughed. You need a name change, don't you, son? Really happened. Yes, sir. It might be a little more complicated than that, though. Well, let's see it. He treated me differently than the women who came before me, but I knew that this undeserved kinship would soon shatter with his stare. I presented the judge with 2 different orders. The first was to change both name and gender designation. The second, just in case, was a simple name change. The judge took a good long look at the first order, then eyed me, then glanced back at the paper, then back to me, back to the paper, back to me, back to the paper. Unusual case. I don't think I've actually seen this before. He was the kind of man you'd expect a judge to be, right? I mean, of course, he was white and male, but also he was silver-haired and broad-shouldered. Perhaps he was once athletic, though he seemed too tall for football, too thick for baseball. I imagined him playing basketball for Baylor. He picked up one of the law references on his desk and thumbed through. To be honest with you, I don't even know where I might find a precedent. Nope, it's not under sex. Darn it, can't find a section about gender. The court had fallen silent. I could feel 10 eyes magnified with the fury of a woman scorned, sizing me up from behind, 10 ears pricked up in interest. The judge looked me over, but not in the way most people do when they consider what it means to have a transgender person standing in front of them. I didn't feel his eyes on my chest or my crotch. He framed my shoulders. He looked into my face and eyes. I hoped my tie was straight. Suddenly, the appearance of the knot was all that stood between me and that M on my driver's license. If only I'd gone for the Windsor knot instead of the four-in-hand. I just don't think I have the authority to do this kind of thing, he concluded. I can't decree that someone can be something else. I mean, if I did, you'd have people changing their identities all the time. He looked at me, it felt like, for help. I replied that I knew a few people who had done it, that perhaps a change in gender designation was just up to the judge's discretion, that he could even write, petitioner may not marry a person of the same sex before he signed it, just to cover himself in any sticky gay marriage situations. Remember what year it was? My judge frowned. I want you to know that I know that this is not a decision that you came to lightly. I know that you have to undergo many things in order to do this, and I do not have any problem with that. I really don't. In fact, if I knew there was some case law somewhere, I'd do it for you. I really would, but as it stands right now, I don't believe that I can. I answered that I could go find out for him. I could be back with a law book later that day. Well, do you want to change your name? I can do that for you at least. He felt almost like a nice neighbor who, finding a would-be borrowed lawnmower out of gas, offered at least a weed whacker with which to do the job. From behind me in the courtroom, I heard a divorcee whisper, "I think I saw this on Oprah." He swore me in, so help me God. It went on record in the state of Texas that I changed my name as part of my gender transition, and that each of those names reflects my mother's family history. When I uttered the words sex change into the record, my judge blinked reflexively. Finally, he adjudicated, ordered, and decreed me Scott Turner Schofield, and as I exited past the 5 silent women, he called out after me, "Good luck, son." Now, medically speaking, I got a letter from a therapist diagnosing me with gender identity disorder so I could go after hormones and surgery if I wanted to. In 2005, I talked my way into getting hormones out of the Feminist Women's Health Center in Atlanta. It took months and every scrap of critical analysis I had to convince the women working there to do the mission of the Men's Health Project, founded in memory of Robert Eads, whose life was the subject of the 2001 documentary, Southern Comfort. Which is why these cis folks thinking that we just want to like willy-nilly inject children with hormones is so infuriating. Gatekeeping is dysphoria's last-ditch push against us, and it uses every last weapon it has, from trusted but ignorant doctors to health insurance administrators and back into your own health concerns where there are no studies to calm you with. Stop acting like it's easy. We are only asking for it to just be possible for more of us on the timeline that is right for each of us, which can only be measured as the time right up until the moment before we kill ourselves, or rather are killed by the disease of dysphoria. I don't know about you, but I would rather have a trans or non-binary medically transitioning child than a dead child. That happened. In 2007, Candace Cain became the first openly trans woman to star in primetime drama. In 2008, trans model Isis King was featured in America's Next Top Model, and America got its first openly transgender mayor, Stu Rasmussen. In 2009, Chaz Bono, transgender son of Cher and Sonny Bono, announces his transition. By the way, are you noticing a ratio here? 3 trans women's stories for 1 trans man's and no non-binary people? That's about right. Now, just a reminder, seeing yourself in culture is one of the most powerful weapons against dysphoria. We're doing well now, but we are failing trans men and non-binary people badly still. This also happened in 2009. Hopefully the volume will work. Let's see.
Let's be a winner.
Hi, ladies.
Hi.
My name's Scott Schofield, and I just flew in from out of town. I'm on tour with my book right now. I spend most of my time out teaching colleges and universities.
Not interested, sorry.
That's okay. I go around talking about masculinity and what it means to be a guy and how to be different from most of the macho stereotypes. What I do in order to do that is a theater show called Becoming a Man in 127 Easy Steps. And I spend most of my time in that show up on a Cirque du Soleil type fabric, which I climb up and do tricks in and all that stuff.
Wow. How much do you weigh?
I weigh 145 pounds.
That's gorgeous. How tall are you?
5'11".
That's gorgeous.
Likewise.
I'm Jen.
Thank you, Jen. Thanks, ladies.
I like nerd hot.
He's definitely nerd. I don't know about hot.
There was only ever one episode of this show. And it premiered and had its series finale the slot before the Bachelor finale in 2009. So when I applied to be on this show that was really titled The Conveyor Belt of Love, I mean, with a title like that, how could I not, right? I gave them my name, which they could Google. I told them the most interesting thing about me was my past, and nobody said a word to me about being trans. In the one moment of the show when I could have disclosed that I was trans, I protected myself from the unavoidable shock, horror, and shame that disclosure of trans identity on national TV would have been in 2009. I didn't disclose. It was an unlikely moment of not acting the way that dysphoria's self-hatred would have me act. The next morning, the headline, and I quote, "Surprise, we gave you a tranny," appeared on Pop Sugar, which was one of the biggest entertainment blogs at the time. It has since been scrubbed from the web, but here's another version. When asked to comment on my decision to, quote, deceive people by not immediately disclosing my transgender label to the folks at home, I said, I have always been an openly transgender man, hence my decision to appear on a reality game show. Take that, dysphoria. Okay, trigger warning. I'm not gonna get graphic about what happened, mostly because I don't remember it. I'm gonna tell you what I thought about it though, which to me is worse. In a move of liberated expansion, I determined that I could explore my sexual orientation as much as my gender identity, and I began sleeping with gay men. And then I was roofied and raped by one. And in a move of complete dysphoria, I believed that I deserved it. I went to the bar by myself, I accepted the drink, I was game for a hookup. For a decade, I believed that this is just what happens to you if you're not smart enough about it. My therapist had to repeat to me dozens of times, you could be naked and drunk and standing on a table and that would not give anybody the right to have sex with you in that state. A dozen times, right? Now, to be clear, I would have taken care of somebody else who was drugged at a bar like I was, and I certainly would never believe that it is anybody's fault if the same thing happens to them. So why didn't I believe that I deserved the same treatment? Why couldn't I believe it? Well, dysphoria says, you don't get to be taken care of the way other people do. And also, I don't take care of you because I hate you. Now, until this happened, I was cobbling together healthcare between the different state programs for low-income people and using my educational privilege to talk myself into any program I could to get the care that I needed. I had also been chased out of a doctor's office by a doctor who threatened to report me to this shitty insurance company I paid too much to when I was trying to get treatment for a respiratory infection that wouldn't go away. That's right, a doctor refused to help me breathe and threatened to take away my access to health care because she didn't like the way I lived my gender. The ACA and my gender identity disorder diagnosis no longer being a pre-existing condition meant that I could go to the doctor, talk about my medical care, and expect that it would be a medical conversation that I could get care around. Imagine that. I still got asked to do a pelvic exam when I came in with a sore throat by 2 separate doctors, but at least I could afford the copay. Finally, someone caught me trying to kill myself. Thanks to the Affordable Care Act, I was able to get inpatient and intensive outpatient care that I could pay for. I'm gonna tell you a story about it. I was conscious and not psychotic anymore when I walked into the vomit green hallway of STAB ward. It's kind of a sick abbreviation of stabilization. A social worker asked me if I had had any other hallucinations. I figured I was already in the nut house. I may as well tell them everything, even the things that sounded too crazy to say out loud. Just before I overdosed, I had a conversation with a raven. I was sitting on a snowbank and he told me it would be okay if I killed myself because it would make room for someone else who really wanted to be here. I figured he would know, so I listened to him. So a raven spoke to you? She clarified in a tone that suggested that this may be the least crazy thing she dealt with all day. Yes, and other birds too. Sometimes I think that if I could only remember the language of the birds, that I could speak to them too and they would tell me what to do. I wondered if this sounded as crazy to her as it did to me, if she understood how scary it felt to know that birds tried to talk to you while you were sane enough to know that they shouldn't. How many times have you tried to kill yourself? She inquired instead. 4. Now, Scott, you seem so much more intelligent than that. In my head, I screamed, what the fuck is that supposed to mean? But out loud, I whispered, sometimes I think it's because I'm too smart. She left me in the hallway and entered the bulletproof glass box separating the men's ward from the women's. I guess they thought that because the glass is bulletproof, it must also be soundproof, but I heard her tell the orderly, that child has already tried to commit suicide 4 times, to which the orderly replied, laughing, 4 times? Damn, just die already. I'm all for dark humor. In fact, I prefer it. But in that moment, it just made me cry. A tall, large black woman tiptoed quietly out of her room. Her hair stood on end and her barrettes and pigtails made her look like a child. Are you a boy or a girl? They had put me in the women's ward because they said a man might get offended at me being in his ward. I asked them how many women in mental institutions they thought might have 1 or 2 problems with men, especially a man on their ward. They responded that my genitalia determined that I would go into the women's ward and that they would check to ensure compliance. I got the feeling it wouldn't matter what they found physically. They had decided that I was a woman. But the woman asking me felt like a small child, despite her size, so I replied to her question the way I would to a kid. What do you think I am? I think you're a boy. All the other women on the ward thought I was a boy too, but they're crazy, of course. But after the 5th physical fight in a day broke out on the other side of the glass box, I found myself grateful to somehow still be a woman through institutional eyes. But I guess transgender people can't all be as crazy as people say, because if we were, we'd have our own ward. I got diagnosed with bipolar disorder. My therapist of 7 years revealed that she had once diagnosed me with borderline personality disorder, but never formally. She apologized for having put her gender bias into practice. Women with bipolar disorder are often misdiagnosed with borderline. So for 7 years of weekly visits, we did not treat my symptoms correctly because of gender. But maybe dysphoria clouded a clear diagnosis. I often wonder how much of the depression, suicidality, but also full body euphoria I used to swing between was really just pulls between the poles of a false binary we have created personally, relationally, and institutionally around gender. When a politician said something homophobic or transphobic or both, it cut to the quick of my soul. When I saw someone trans in the media, it felt like nothing less than being a part of history. When I wore an article of clothing that made me feel okay, or when someone called me he, I felt the incredible and rare sensation of belonging in my own body. Every one of these sensations felt like huge forces of energy, existence, not just experience. Was dysphoria the underlying cause of mental illness I experienced for so many years? Now that I know what to do about dysphoria, I wonder if it wasn't the other way around. I wonder that for me, and I also wonder whether it helps you think more clearly about some of your clients. I do not believe my therapist would have not correctly diagnosed me for so many years if she knew that she was in the thrall of gender dysphoria as a person acted upon by social factors and as a practitioner acted upon by institutional factors. I do not think that many of you professionals in this room know this yet about yourselves, and I ask you right now to wake up and look at it as if the lives of your clients depended on it. I also want to thank you for being here doing this work right now.
Okay, here goes.
This is my first day of recovery.
What would you do if I sang out of tune? Would you stand up and walk out on me? Lend me your ears and I'll sing you a song, and I'll try not to sing out of key. Oh, I get by with a little help from my friends. I get high with a little help from my friends. I'm gonna try with a little help from my friends. No, we have to do it right.
Therapists and caregivers can be our first friends in the battle against dysphoria in all of its forms when we don't even have a friend in ourselves. We need you to get ahead of dysphoria for us, to figure out what it is and how it operates on all of the levels. We need you to be a little smarter and stronger than us to help us get by. Now, after a suicide attempt where I'm not convinced that I didn't actually die for a little while, I decided to live with abandon. One piece of that was to stop wrapping up my chest like I was ashamed of it every day and to have surgery. It took me 7 years from the start of medical transition for me to decide on surgery because of institutional and relational dysphoria. Before surgery, all of the what-if questions, most unbelievably for a persisting child as I was the quiet belief that one day I might actually wake up from it all and decide to be a woman, which was really everybody else's fervent hope that I inject myself daily with to undermine the truth that I knew about who I was. After surgery, when I lay down on the beach for the first time, feeling the sun and air all over my body, I wondered who I would be if I had claimed myself right from the start. I tried not to mourn all of those years of loss for too long. I went swimming so I wouldn't know tears from ocean, and I left the tears in the water that day. When I woke up from surgery, I had the experience of a voice, hearing a voice, one that did not belong to me or anyone else in that room, telling me, the soul has no gender. I can't explain how deep this hit me. I'm still trying to fully understand it, though I am much closer than I ever was. Now in 2013, I was invited to give a TED Talk that I titled Ending Gender. It would be way too meta to stand on stage, showing you video of me standing on stage there, so I'll give it a rest. Though at this point, the label non-binary had come into cultural consciousness for like a year or two. It was kind of starting to be there. People critiqued the talk for the idea of ending gender, as if I really believed that that was possible. The label that we didn't really have in 2013 was gender expansive, which I think would have changed the nuance, I think. What I was asking for in that talk, which uses vocabulary that just 7 years of rapid evolution and clarity later is now largely out of date, was for us to stop using gender to harm each other and ourselves. For all of us to be allowed to use whatever aspects of gender that have been labeled as masculine and feminine in whatever ways work and feel good for us, and to not punish anyone for their particular mix of it all. I was asking for us to allow gender expansiveness and to stop gender dysphoria. That's what I meant. That's what I still mean now. 2014 to 15 saw the biggest influx of media representation of transgender people in bigger ways than ever before. Laverne Cox blew people's minds in Orange is the New Black. Transparent put Amazon on the map for streaming series. By the way, I just want you to know that. We didn't understand that Amazon Video was going to be what it was until Transparent. Like, that's significant, okay? Even though creator Jill Soloway themselves calls it a dangerous mistake to have chosen to hire a cis man to play trans women, but they did institute trans-affirmative action to hire trans and non-binary people at every level of the production, which no one had done. Caitlyn Jenner wound up on the cover of Vanity Fair in lingerie to announce her transition, and I became the first openly transgender actor in daytime television in a recurring role on The Bold and the Beautiful. When you work for something your whole life, fight for it, pray for it, sacrifice, deal with death threats and casual contempt, you don't wait around for luck. You have your own back. People ask me the difference between me and Nick. At the time I said these lines, I didn't believe the part about not waiting around for luck or having your own back, because dysphoria.
Hey, Nick. Glad you came by. I heard you, and I learned something.
Prove it. Don't discriminate. Firing public sector employees because they're transgender is against the law. So says the Attorney General. You too could join the 21st century. At that moment were all the speeches I had said to myself in the shower, after workshops that never went well with employers, got signal boosted to 33 million homes globally. By the way, on a personal note, 2015 was when I really stopped lying. When lying became actually almost impossible for me to do. It was organic, the same way tears almost dried up completely when I started taking testosterone. I don't know whether it was everyone telling more truth than ever into the megaphone of media, or me being one of them, or what, but it was a powerful liberation from the form of dysphoria that being a compulsive liar is a symptom of. Remember what I said about how I wonder whether my diagnosis of bipolar disorder was not actually an underlying cause of my dysphoria, but rather a symptom of it? After the cultural euphoria of trans visibility and acceptance, institutions and relationships had an epic mood swing. Institutions and people simply could not handle their dysphoria of trans people and non-binary people being liberated, and the freakout continues to be horrible and terrifying. Maybe some of you remember it. Maybe some of you blocked it out, waking up to these headlines every morning. It had a deeply negative impact on transgender people. Bathroom bills have a body count. And then the election happened. I don't have to get into it, you all remember. Let's not relive the trauma. Let's just say it was America's biggest encounter with dysphoria on a holistic level. Us seeing ourselves in a way we never had before, in a way most of us do not like. A number at least as big as the popular vote that year, and more with every passing tweet. We know ourselves at our core not to be this. After that huge pop of visibility, suddenly the government started disappearing us from the .gov website to being counted on our country's vital statistics. One form of dysphoria is the feeling of existing and yet not really being there at all. 2017, .gov erasure, trans military ban, Department of Education and Justice officially unsupportive of trans students. HUD rescinds emergency shelter protections and stops counting homeless LGBTQ people. HHS stops counting LGBTQ elders. License to discriminate on religious grounds is enacted by Department of Justice. So the cognitive dissonance reoccurs when, in popular culture that year, of the 278 regular and recurring LGBTQ characters on broadcast cable and streaming programs, 16, that's a full 6%, become transgender. That doesn't sound like much, I know, but it was more than double the numbers of characters that came out in 2015, which was like 7. And that was considered an explosion of representation. In 2017, my partner and I announced that we were getting married. In the way that immigrants, the Jewish community, and LGBTQ people everywhere experienced an unexpected backlash of hatred after the election, we also did. An entire wing of my family, cousins who felt like brothers, a second set of parents to me growing up, refused to attend our wedding because they said we were 2 girls getting married and they could not support it. This felt especially dysphoric because from 2004, when I came out to them as trans, until 2017, that's 13 full years, not one of these relatives had so much as misgendered me even once. I felt like I had been welcomed at family gatherings. I built my sense of self post-transition on my family's acceptance of me, and it was mysteriously ripped away from me at a time that was supposed to be the happiest of my life. Of course, it wasn't mysterious at all. It was the emboldening of hatred that came with the election. It was America's dysphoria that took all love and respect, even among family, along with it. This relational dysphoria between family members who even still claim to love one another, based in the institutional dysphoria of what some powerful religious people have done to a population who only want to love God well, hit me in my body. Faced with the internal reflection of myself as a girl getting married, in the way that how your family sees you can be such a deep part of who you know you are and how you see yourself, it struck my entire body numb, racked with rage about this and the plain injustice of it. I feel as though I lost a loving part of myself that I cherished, which I do not know how I will ever get back. I am still rebuilding my life since this lightning bolt of relational, institutional, and personal dysphoria hit it. I don't know if I will ever truly heal from it, but I do believe that I can. Now, here's something really important to consider. After the tipping point and the pendulum swing, something really started happening for transgender and non-binary people. We saw it in the media, and I saw it directly in my training business. People really started paying attention. They started to care. I could take every workshop that I did from 2002 to 2015, add all of the participants together, and they would still not add up to the level of engaged interest I now see in every workshop I teach in every small town and big city I travel to starting in 2016. That is not hyperbole, I can count it. Now, I'm about to share some disturbing facts that you already know about the state of affairs in our country right now, but before I do, I offer this quote from Mahatma Gandhi, whose teachings on nonviolence I began studying in my recovery from my last suicide attempt. For as violent as it still is for transgender and non-binary people everywhere, all the time now, the path of nonviolence toward ourselves is what we still need in order to enjoy the inevitable moment, not very far in the future, I am convinced, when we do win. The practice of nonviolence is activism that heals dysphoria in all of its forms. We must practice it with our inside voices, in the comment section, in our own communities, and yes, even with our dealings with cis people who harm us. That we will win, even against what is going on now, is inevitable. How we win determines nothing less than our future peace. The way that dysphoria can reverse our personal understanding of our own bodies is being played out writ large by the current government as they overturn policies based on careful studies conducted by the previous administration. Just as we say, I hate you to the mirror, they're saying it to our faces. Just as we self-harm, they are harming us. Just as we hold ourselves to the most impossible delusional standards, they're imposing impossible delusional standards on us. 2018, Department of Education announces they will refuse to respond to civil rights complaints filed by transgender students. Bureau of Prisons reverses biological sex in determining transgender prisoner housing. New York Times reveals that the White House is attempting to redefine sex across the federal government to justify refusals to protect transgender people under federal civil rights law. And in 2018, I got to make a movie that was about how institutional gender blocks us from the music of ourselves, and also partly about being trans in a time before there were words for the experience in the 1920s.
Robert, you have a cigarette?
Does that bother you? People come from all over just to see her.
Him.
Think of it like this. We're all born naked, and the rest is just a disguise. Pose hit the same year, fully doubling the number of trans women represented in media, and we got to see a trans woman on the Oscar stage for a story centering the life and experience of a trans woman. Of the 329 regular and recurring LGBTQ characters on broadcast cable and streaming programs, 17 were transgender in 2018, 9 transgender women, 4 transgender men, and 4 non-binary characters. Now in 2019, out of all the heinous acts that use tax dollars to discriminate against a tiny fraction of the population, the government said it was okay for medical practitioners to let us die in order to fulfill their religious obligations. Suicide is the ultimate act of dysphoria, but so is murder, if you believe, as I do, that all humans are fundamentally good somewhere inside. 2019, HHS announces regulation allowing medical providers to cite personal beliefs in refusing to provide life-saving care for LGBTQ patients. Administration announces it will oppose the Equality Act, bipartisan legislation providing comprehensive non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people in employment, housing, public spaces, education, jury services, credit, and federal funding. HHS announces proposed regulation to strip out protections for transgender patients in the Affordable Care Act. DOJ submits brief arguing that transgender people are not protected by Title VII's prohibition on sex discrimination to the United States Supreme Court. And in 2019, of the 433 regular and recurring LGBTQ characters on scripted broadcast cable and streaming programs, 26 are transgender, an increase of 9 characters from the previous year. 17 are trans women, 5 trans men, and 4 non-binary characters. It's like amid the tragedy of our country's collective dysphoria, we just keep shining. But also, in 2019, I was asked back to my 20th high school reunion by my chosen sister. She begged me to come and sing at an alumni concert. By now, you know I'm always down for a really good story, right? I imagined the screenplay. Badass trans man goes home to backwater and makes a huge splash, right? Turns out everybody was actually pretty cool. Charlotte has a gender center now, and they fought really hard against HB2, that bathroom bill. Things really have changed in 20 years. So I got to just be another alumni, one man's voice in a group of people singing joyfully together. And when we walked into that theater to sing that concert 20 years later, absolutely nothing had changed about the space. Tears just burst out of my face, feeling the person I have become inside that space that has never changed. And then we started singing Les Miserables, which is such a perfect high school musical for so many reasons, right? Suddenly, the trajectory from the trauma of Angels in America to everything I have done with my life until this point came crystal clear. I had been too busy battling my dysphoria and all of the dysphoria all around me to notice that I was only living out my woundedness in the world. I used it as fuel, I spun it to gold for sure, but still, I have been living a life centered around dysphoria on both sides of the battle. How can I ever win? Who would I be, I had to ask myself, without my dysphoria? In that moment, I could feel another version of me calling me into my next big transition. There is a life about to start when tomorrow comes. When tomorrow I accept and love every part of myself and see myself well and whole. When I accept and love every version of gender that exists in myself and in the people around me without seeing them as some threat to my existence. When I grab hold of my freedom to be in this body and in this life as an actuality and not some permission I have to ask in the form of legislation or rights. Your heart echoes the beating of the drums. I had to see without question that I have started to become that person. I am that guy I knew I was before I had words to wish myself into being. I am powerful and I use my power to help others feel powerful. If that's not the opposite of dysphoria in all of its forms, I don't know what is. I don't know when I will arrive at a life free of dysphoria, but I do know that it is possible. So I was finishing up this presentation at like 2 o'clock in the morning, and I got one of these sort of wild ideas that doesn't end this all so neatly in a bow. even though this fabulous gay way of ending it with a musical is pretty great, right? Right? So I have a story that happened in 2019 that isn't related to representation exactly, but it is related to dysphoria on a really deep level. And I think we have time to tell it. Would you like to hear it? Yes. Okay. I created this epic story called Becoming a Man in 127 Easy Steps because I needed the space of 127 stories to get anywhere close to what being a man, as far as I define that, really means. Being a man is personal, social, and cultural. Being a man is emotional no matter what they tell you. Some men treat being a man like a religion. I'm not so sure on that, but it is definitely spiritual. I didn't mean to go to naked gay men's yoga. Truly. I landed in New York after an 8-hour flight. I looked up the closest yoga studio to my hotel in Chelsea, and I was told that Yoga for the People had a 7:30 class that night. No nudity mentioned. I got there and I found that the class I wanted to attend had been canceled. And yet there was this crowd of men holding yoga mats directly across the street. I asked the friendliest looking one if they were there for Yoga for the People, and he replied, "No, this is naked gay men's yoga." Like that's a sentence you say every day. I really did not mean to go to naked gay men's yoga. First of all, I'm not gay, though several concerned citizens have asked my wife whether I have explored the possibility yet. I have, and I'm not, but I will take the compliment. And gay men, as much as straight men, are not always cool with trans men. In fact, sometimes it's worse, depending on how often that man was told that he really just wants to be a woman. I crossed the street and hoped that my Yoga for the People class would magically manifest. The gay men filtered into their building, and the teacher, a gorgeous black man whose dreads and musculature made him look like a lion, held the door open. "You sure you're not here for this?" he called over. My mind replied with the mantra that has gotten me everywhere I ever wanted to be in life: fuck it. I crossed and I spoke to the teacher. "I'm not sure this class is for me." They never are. But trust me, plenty of scared boys like you have shown up pretending that they're going to Yoga for the People. It's fine once you jump in, I promise. Okay, but see, I'm trans. You're what? I'm transgender. I'm a transgender man. Is it okay if I come in? Now, it took a minute for the teacher to understand what I meant. Transgender men still don't really exist in the imagination of our culture yet. People think about transgender women, but not men, and certainly not non-binary folks. You wouldn't know what to look at me, so here I am, hidden in plain sight, just a man. Hell yes, you can come in. He swore it like an oath. We are inclusive in this space, and if someone's got a problem, they can talk to me about it. Then he closed the door like he was hugging me in. The studio was dark, lit by candles. 15 men were arranged, facing each other across an aisle, because that's not awkward. But you could hardly see anything, I figured. I dropped my drawers in the corner, grabbed my rented mat and towel, and kept my nether regions covered until my crossed legs covered anything anyone else might be looking at. They weren't. These guys were clearly so used to doing yoga together naked, they just registered their gaze inward. I'm a yoga people, all right. I hear you. You feel represented? Doesn't it feel good? The class started a typical strong asana session with one glaring difference, but only to me. I kept my eyes on the end of my nose as we moved through the positions. At one point, the teacher moved behind me and guided my hips to tilt ever so slightly more up. And I realized that I had never done downward facing dog correctly in 10 years of practice. You have to align the anus parallel to the ceiling. he whispered and walked away. Now you know. Yoga literally saved my life. 10 years into transition, I still wasn't feeling comfortable in my body. I was so depressed about that and the state of just being a trans person in a transphobic world generally that finally a good friend of mine suggested I tried it. I rolled my eyes. I said, "I'm not trying to join some cult of pretzel people, Allison." To which she replied, "You're not, and anyway, what do you have to lose?" She had a point. In Hinduism, one manifestation of God is known as Ardhanarishwara, and I was greeted in my very first yoga class by a statue of this being who embodies both masculine and feminine qualities, like God, erasing the shame of my conservative religious Southern upbringing as I let that sink in, that there is a religion that acknowledges my lived experience, glorifies it, turns it into a brass statue even. Yoga showed me the path through my physical body into a truth that is so much bigger than myself. And now, 10 years into my yoga practice, I was having yet another eye-opening experience. At some point, I began looking around the room of naked men. I have a strong yoga practice, and in 45 minutes, I hadn't broken a sweat. There were men in their 60s struggling, but even men in their 30s sweating pools all over their mats. Men of color, white men, men with tight muscles, men whose bodies sagged. I didn't look at anybody's genitals, but I didn't avoid them either. The room was dark, and the shapes between our legs would all be different based on anything from height to religion and other accidents of birth and being. I wasn't fixated on theirs or mine. I just kept up with the teacher, murmuring directions for what foot or hand to put where. "We're gonna move in to partner yoga now," the teacher whispered to me. "Do you want to partner with the guy next to you, or do you want to work with me?" Obviously, I wanted to work with the person who was the least stranger to me in the room. "Okay, but we'll have to be in the middle of the room demonstrating for everybody." "I'll make sure you look good, don't worry." The center of the room felt much brighter than my row off to the side, and now everybody was definitely looking at my naked body. When I teach people about transgender sensitivity, I always remind them to stay in the present with the person. Don't imagine what their past might have been as a differently gendered person. It's gone now, and it takes you out of the conversation that you're having. If they're actively in transition, you can't stay in the past or jump forward to where they might be headed, so you just have to be here now with them. That's just what I did with my naked teacher and all of those naked men staring at my naked body. In partner yoga, you hold the other person so that they can get a really deep back bend. You help them stretch just far enough into feeling really good. You generally don't do it naked, but regardless, it isn't sexual. It's a deep and careful caring to help them achieve their best pose, or at least to not drop them. From my vantage point in the room, I saw all of these men fully focused on their partners. The older men, certainly survivors of the plague of AIDS, getting a deep and non-sexual intimacy, coming here every week for 20 years. The men who were not at all flexible, the way their partners watched them for any squint or grimace so as not to cause them pain. The young guys who would jaunt off into New York once they put on their clothes like they didn't have a care in the world. They cared for each other with a focused groundedness that they might not have had anywhere else in life. Take this from someone who has seen the contrast. There is a quality of energy to a group of men who are focused on something productive. There is an energetic quality of a man who cares. You can't pretend it doesn't exist, although we've created a culture in which men everywhere suppress and deny it. In that room, I felt it deeper than anywhere ever, and I was a part of it. When we finished, our teacher crowded us into a rugby scrum together, a candle in the center of us, of our circle on the floor. "We're gonna take turns now. Every one of you has to look everybody else in the eye," the teacher instructed. In this moment, my whole body, very visible, I stared into the other 16 sets of eyes, those soul windows. I saw that some people were so confused, presumably by the shape of my genitals in the diverse mix of shapes in that circle, that they simply couldn't find my eyes at all inside all of their mental turmoil about it. I saw the look of people who truly hadn't noticed. In a few, I met a gaze that told me very clearly I did not belong there, and I was empowered by how ashamed those people look when they had to look me in the eye to tell me that naked truth. And in some eyes, I saw a warmth and welcoming that I have become used to in most places I go now. That is to say, I saw it all exactly as it is. I was both completely in my body and completely in my soul. I felt part of the one soul we share, which yoga makes us conscious of. Being trans can feel like such an enormous difference, as vast as existence, and yet it felt so small in that moment when I felt, oh God, I'm gonna say it, and I am even gonna mean it, where I felt so one with the universe. There's a mantra in yoga that says it better, and the gift of naked gay men's yoga was my deep realization of it. Om Tat Sat. I am that I am. That is exactly what being a man has always meant for me inside my journey of it, and inside this accidental moment in a yoga studio in Chelsea, almost 20 years after I began my transition. I found my gender identity deeply, not uncomplicatedly confirmed by a group of other men for the first time. And nobody said a word. That's me. Thank you.